is on Tuesday. Remember that the exam is on Tuesday, and the final paper will be due next Thursday, and you should be getting your essays back in time so that you can make any adjustments that you need to for the final submission of the paper. So today there is a lot of material that I would like to cover, and I've kind of broken it down under these headings. So we're going to complete our conversation about Renaissance Florence by looking at Michelangelo's Florentian library, thinking about how theory was applied and practiced during the Renaissance. We'll shift our attention to Rome and look at urban and architectural developments in 16th and 17th century Rome, focusing on papal patronage, and just a handful of projects that reflect very directly on the aims of the papacy during this period. We'll shift to France and look at 16th and 17th century France, ending with, hopefully we'll be able to end with a conversation about the Enlightenment, which just makes a transition to the material that you covered with Dr. Mumford in the fall in your earlier class, your earlier survey class. So I want to remind you that we ended talking about Renaissance Florence and the application of theory in practice, primarily by Brunelleschi, but also we looked at the work of Alberti and talked about different approaches to the use of classical precedents during this period. Remember that when we first started looking at the Renaissance, I emphasized that we always have to ask ourselves which classicism Renaissance architects are looking at, and then how are they using it. It was never a kind of slavish one-to-one borrowing of Renaissance precedents, but an interpretation of the classical past in new circumstances. So to finish this conversation, we're going to return to the Church of San Lorenzo, and specifically the space under this dome that you're seeing here on the right side of the screen. This is the new sacristy, and then we'll also look at the Laurentian Library, which is embedded in the courtyard of this building. So the new sacristy, remember that the old sacristy is over here, by Brunelleschi over here on the left, and then the new sacristy on the right. The new sacristy following the old sacristy by almost 100 years. So we tend to look at a building like San Lorenzo and we think of it kind of locked into a specific time period, but you have to understand that over time it became this laboratory that evolved. It wasn't a kind of static, fixed monument. And when we compare the new sacristy to the old sacristy, we immediately see that there are some differences, there are some similarities. So remember that in the old sacristy, we talked about how Brunelleschi wanted to focus on perfect geometries. He wanted to use material to evoke a kind of tectonic language. And he wanted to use measurement and modules as a way to allow the viewer to understand the logic of the space. Michelangelo in the new sacristy also wanted to do that, but he complicates the rhetoric. He complicates the reading and the understanding of the space. For example, you can see here in the elevation, he adds a zone. So he's not necessarily so interested in that static stability of those three parts in elevation that you see Brunelleschi using here, practically the same scale. Instead, he wants to add a kind of dynamism. When I use the word dynamism, and I'll probably be using it quite a lot today, I'm referring to a sense of movement in the form, either the plan, the geometry of the plan, the proportions, as opposed to a kind of static form, which might be a square, a circle, something that it has a kind of equilibrium to it. A dynamism refers to a sort of movement or energy, expressive energy in the composition. And so we're seeing that obviously here in the new sacristy with this addition of the zone. The volumetric height of the space is significant. You have a kind of sense of this sort of spatial vacuum of verticality that is missing in the old sacristy. Here's the interior of the new sacristy to kind of give you a sense of how Michelangelo complicates this use of material language and its reference to tectonics. Michelangelo actually adds to his palette of materials marble. And the marble that he selected was so perfect, it was so perfectly white, that it can blend in with the color of the plaster that in the work of Brunelleschi suggests this kind of infill condition. You know that Michelangelo was a sculptor, and he approached his engagement with the wall as a sculptor would, sort of digging into it. And the marble that he uses to line these niches kind of conveys this sort of internal workings of the wall in a way that Brunelleschi never did. Brunelleschi always worked on the surface of the wall. Michelangelo digs into it, and he uses the marble to allow the viewer to read this kind of complexity of the surface. The place where we see this most readily is in the Laurentian Library, so I want to take a little bit of time to unpack this further. In the case of the Laurentian Library, this is a library that was for the clergy who were attached to San Lorenzo. Michelangelo worked on the vestibule, which is what you're seeing here, and he also worked on the reading room. And this vestibule is a very tight space. It's a pretty small space, but it's very tall, which is one of the reasons that if you look for photographs of this space, it's very hard to find an image that really conveys the totality of it. It's very hard to find or to get a viewpoint that allows you to see the whole space. But this, and honestly, the stair that you're seeing here fills up most of it. There's very little space to occupy except for this stair. The main thing that I want to focus on here is precisely this idea that I was just describing of Michelangelo actually digging into the wall like a sculptor would and revealing the guts of the building. So I want you to look at this image. If you're thinking about this corner here, we talked about the surface of the wall being a kind of tectonic datum. Everything in front of that surface is meant to be a reflection or a representation of structure that is, in the architect's mind, embedded in the wall. Okay? So what you see happening here is that Michelangelo continues to use this white plaster as a kind of infill that represents that datum. In the case of the Laurentian Library, he uses that stone, that gray stone called Pietra Serena, he uses that very expressively. So instead of making a language on top of, or a kind of using that on top of the wall, up above this zone you can see that he's actually peeled it away to reveal the supports themselves. Okay? And he digs into the wall to make these niches, and in the case of the Laurentian Library, he uses Pietra Serena to reflect that condition inside the wall. More telling, I think, is this image. I don't know how they got this, but this image from the top allows you to see the play between that surface in front of the wall and the structure embedded in the wall. And I want you to notice something. Remember that when we were talking about Brunelleschi and the old sacristy, we talked about his use of brackets as a kind of tectonic cue that refers to support. And then we talked about those brackets in San Lorenzo in the church and how Michelozzo misused them visually. Here at the Laurentian Library, obviously Michelangelo is participating in this conversation about tectonics and the various elements that are expressed in Pietra Serena. So I want to call your attention to these brackets. He uses the Pietra Serena to make these brackets, but look at the shape of them. They're not compact in the way that they were in the work of Brunelleschi and Michelozzo. Instead, they're almost like they're extruded almost like they're pulled like a kind of taffy, really extended below the columns, which visually they're intended to convey support of. In other words, these brackets visually should be supporting these columns. However, if you look at this photograph, you'll notice that the brackets are actually in a plane in front of the columns, so they cannot be supporting. So this is Michelangelo participating in this conversation about tectonics and about what structure is actually doing. It's not as if the columns in this space are actually load bearing. Even they are a representation. And so it's all a kind of rhetoric, a tectonic rhetoric that he's proposing here. And it's I'll go back just to the slide so that you kind of understand the ways in which he pushes this conversation. Notice that the columns are up above. There's no scale figure in this photograph, I realize, but just so that you can tell, this parapet wall right here is a little bit shorter than I am. Okay? I don't know if you can see me under the screen, but so it's probably about 5 feet tall, which means that the columns are way up above head height. And so tectonically speaking, you would expect the column to be on the ground level, first of all. And now that it's elevated, it has to be supported by something. The brackets visually are doing this job, but because they're in a different plane, they're actually not functioning in this way. So I bring this in just to kind of complicate your understanding of Renaissance architecture. We tend to think of it as this idealized, stable, perfect execution of theory, when in fact it was highly complex. We also want to talk today about Rome. We haven't really been back to Rome since we looking at early Christian times, and there's a reason for that. You know that the Roman Empire fell in the 5th century, and there was this period of chaos in the city where it was highly disorganized. The city infrastructure declined and ended up in ruin. But in the meantime, the Pope of the church, the head of the Catholic Church, remained in the city and tried to run the church from his so-called capital in the city. In the 14th century, there was a crisis in the church, and we haven't talked much about how the Pope is elected, but the Pope is elected by a group of clergy who, in 1378, could not agree. There was one faction that wanted one guy, there was another faction that wanted another guy. They couldn't agree, and at the end, the head of the church, the kind of government of the church, fragmented. One of these guys went to Avignon in the south of France. One went to Pisa, not very far from Florence, and another stayed in Rome. And during this period, there was just chaos within the papacy and within the government of the church. Finally, this is resolved in 1417 with the election of Pope Martin V. Even with the election of Martin V, Rome was still a dangerous place to be. It was, in terms of building fabric, it was highly disorganized. It was kind of in ruins, and the government of the city didn't run very well, and there was constantly a threat of revolt on the part of the people. So even after the election of Martin V, the popes did not return to Rome. They Martin V ruled the papacy from Florence, actually. So this is one of the reasons that we haven't looked at Rome, because honestly there hasn't been an organized urban planning program. There hasn't been very active architectural patronage during this period because it's been unstable. This changes with the election of Pope Nicholas V in 1447. Nicholas V decides that it's time for the papacy to return to Rome. He understood that the appearance of the city reflected the character of the church. If the city was in disarray, it conveyed to people around the world that the church also was unstable and ungoverned and disorganized. And so he wrote a text that he called the Renovatio Romae, which means the renovation of Rome. He supposed that the Pope should be directly involved with the maintenance of the city and the beautification of it and the development of it. So he, in this text, he urged popes who followed him to understand the city of Rome as a direct reflection of the health of the church. And as a consequence, a number of popes for the next couple of centuries took the city of Rome as an important subject of patronage, and they intervened with it. How did they do that? Well, one thing that they did was they tried to systematize the circulation within the city. So they drove through the city, major straight streets, and this view that you're seeing here on the screen shows some of these main arteries, these armatures that they drove into the city to connect major monuments, especially the churches that would be visited by pilgrims. Okay? So they knew that they had to make clear, wide, straight streets to allow people to move from place to place, especially the most important churches. They also got involved in bringing sources of fresh water into the city. By this time, the Tiber River, which had long been a source of drinking water and hygiene for the city, was completely polluted. The water was not drinkable. It was unhealthy. And so the popes eventually got involved in building new aqueducts that brought water into the city. They built new fountains to deliver clean water to the city. They re-systematized the sewage system and all this infrastructure so that the city began to work well again. So the Renovatio Romae was partly involved in reorganizing the city, or kind of making it healthy and usable again. The other thing that Nicholas V did, he made a very important decision on the part of the papacy, which determined a lot of the focus of papal architectural patronage for decades to come. Up until this time, the papacy had been based at a church down here in the kind of southeast of the city of Rome. And Pope Nicholas V made the strategic decision to move the papacy, its administration, and the main church that it celebrated from to St. Peter's Basilica over here. Now, we talked about St. Peter's when we were talking about early Christianity, and we looked at the patronage of Constantine and how important that was for the establishment of the church. Why would Nicholas V make this key choice? Think about his position. He is engaging the city of Rome at a time when the papacy has been very weak, very vulnerable. And what he needs to do through his patronage is convey the legitimacy of papal authority. So he does this by moving the papacy to St. Peter's. Why? St. Peter is a key figure, remember, in the history of the Catholic Church. St. Peter was supposedly identified by Jesus as the person who would grow the church after Jesus' death and resurrection. So the idea was, in some way, figuratively, St. Peter was technically the first pope. He was designated to run the church. Okay? So by occupying the church designated or assigned to or dedicated to St. Peter, you can see that Nicholas is making a one-to-one connection. He wants you to kind of create a lineage from St. Peter to himself, Nicholas V, and legitimize the authority of the papacy. So the location of St. Peter's is critical. Now, the church is basically in a ruin. Nicholas V begins a program of trying to rebuild St. Peter's. We're going to come back to this because Nicholas really never got this program of renovating St. Peter's off the ground. It really doesn't start happening until the end of the 15th century. So we're going to come back to that. But this idea of renovating Rome and understanding the city as a vehicle for communication, that's very, very important. So here's an overview of the city of Rome, and I think this aerial view kind of captures really clearly this program of driving these straight streets through the city and connecting. This happens over the course of several, actually more than a century, that various programs of intervention happen on the part of the Pope. So this all didn't happen right away. It was a process. But you can kind of see how important it is with this labyrinth of streets to create direct circulation, which was impossible before. One important spot that is significant for this renovation happened, it was intervened with, let's say, in the mid-16th century. That is the Campidoglio. The Campidoglio is significant for Rome, for the history of Rome. We talked about it back when we were looking at ancient Rome. It's the site of the Tabularium. Remember that the Tabularium, which is located here, was the location where the law tablets were kept in ancient Rome. And the hill looks out over the Forum. By the time of the mid-16th century, this place was a disaster. It was all grown over, the buildings were in ruins, and it was an embarrassment. So Pope Paul III commissioned Michelangelo to re-systematize it, reorganize it, and produce this beautiful square that is located in the heart of the city of Rome today. This included building these two buildings here, which are used for the civic government, and clarifying the facade of the Tabularium, making this long axial approach, kind of a ceremonial approach by way of this long stair, and using this paving to organize the piazza in front of the Tabularium. Notice again that dynamism that Michelangelo brings to the project. It's not a perfect circle, it's an ellipse, which adds a kind of formal energy to the space. This space was also really important to the papacy. It wasn't just a matter of this site being related to the civic government. When a new pope was elected, he would make a procession from one side of the city to St. Peter's, across the city, and this procession would go through this piazza. It was an embarrassment that it was in such disarray. And so by making this formal space, he makes a kind of urban room with this almost exaggerated processional artery of this stair. They make a dignified frame for the procession of the Pope. This procession was a kind of symbolic gesture on the part of the Pope to take possession of the city of Rome. He was claiming his authority over the city, not just of the church, but of the city itself. And so it was important that he occupy this civic space and have an urban setting where his authority and his legitimacy could be publicly conveyed. Here is just a facade of the palace that Michelangelo produced, and you can see that it's very formal, it's very disciplined and very rigorous, and that's kind of the language that the papacy wanted to convey in the Campidoglio. The 1500s were a time of great conflict for the church. And so even though popes were involved in renovating the city and they were doing urban infill projects and they were trying to restore the infrastructure, institutionally there were big problems for the church. In the early 16th century, in 1517, actually we're at the 500 anniversary of this event, Martin Luther nailed a document to his cathedral door. Martin Luther lived in what today is known as Germany, and he criticized the church publicly by making a list of all of his complaints of abuses of power on the part of the church. Think about how dramatic and bold this statement was. Because at this time, basically all of most Europe was completely dominated by the Catholic Church. So to criticize and protest against it was a really bold move. This was the start of a movement known as the Protestant Reformation. And remember that Protestant has at its root protest. The thing that the Protestants were protesting against was the Catholic Church and what it perceived to be abuses of power. So what were these abuses of power? What were the complaints about the Catholic Church? So Martin Luther, for example, complained that the church engaged in a practice that he thought was inappropriate relating to pilgrimage. Pilgrims who would visit a church would be told to go visit the church on a certain day, give an amount of money, say certain prayers, and in exchange, the church would forgive them their sins. Martin Luther complained because he called this the sale of indulgences. These gestures on the part of the church that absolved people of their sins were called indulgences. And Martin Luther said this was an economic transaction. This was the church selling salvation, a way of making money. And he said, this is not right. This is not ethical. This is not moral. This is not consistent with the tenets of Christianity. So that's one thing that they complained about. There were other issues as well, and I'll talk about them in a minute. But there were a whole list, 95 arguments or theses that Martin Luther issued against the church. And at first, nobody really made much of this. They didn't think it was very consequential, but eventually this protest movement gained traction. It became more powerful and more influential, and the church actually realized that it had to do something to deal with it. They had to confront these criticisms. Another thing that happened that made the church vulnerable in the 16th century is that in 1527, Rome was attacked militarily. 1527 is the event that we refer to as the sack of Rome. And for political and economic reasons, armies from the north, from the empire in the north, came down and attacked the city of Rome. Eventually, that political conflict was resolved, but it meant that all of the progress that the papacy had been making in the city in terms of its reconstruction wasn't completely reversed, but they had a lot more work to do as a result of the sack. So two events in the early 16th century seriously impacted the church: the sack of Rome in 1527 and the Protestant Reformation. Okay? So how does the church respond? The church realizes that it has to do something to respond and to recover. So in 1545, Pope Paul III convenes what is known as the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent is this key historical point of rupture, after which many things change. Okay? So, the Council of Trent is a convening of members of the church in which they review these complaints on the part of the Protestant Reformation. And they say, okay, maybe some of these things are valid. We will stop certain practices that the Protestants have complained about. However, there are some practices that we are not going to get rid of. And for those practices, we're going to double down. We're going to re-emphasize those practices of the Catholic Church. And so, as a result, after the Council of Trent, they make all of these decisions, they meet over a period of several years, and then at the end, in 1563, they issue their decrees. And these decrees are published and sent out all over Western Europe. They're sent to every Christian parish in the world, presumably, as a way of getting everyone on the same page, everyone in agreement about how the Catholic faith should be practiced. During this time, there are no major churches being constructed in Rome. While the church is working out all of these issues and is in this period of conflict, it's only later that major churches resume being constructed in the city. And so the main one that I want to show you is the church that's on the screen now. This is Il Gesù. It's located right in the center of the city of Rome. And it was built according to recommendations for church plans that were issued by an individual from the period, a Jesuit named St. Carlo Borromeo. Borromeo issued these recommendations for how a church built after the Council of Trent could be a kind of, it could reflect these new practices through its form and the way it functions. So this is one of those examples where it's really important to understand that the form is connected to particular practices, okay? As a result, the Gesù became a model for Counter-Reformation churches for centuries. It could be interpreted, it could be iterated at a different scale. There could be some things that are changed slightly, but in general, I would say that this typology became the church plan for another almost 200 years. And not just in Italy, but in elsewhere as well, throughout Europe. And I would say that I think it's really interesting that as these churches began to be built, it was the rule of the church that church plans had to go to the Jesuits, who were basically in charge of the Inquisition, for review. So if you were an architect during this period and you were producing a church plan, it had to go through an approval process with the Jesuits, who basically decided, is this consistent with how the church's decrees say we should be worshiping? And if they didn't agree, they would send it back, and you'd have to revise it. So that's why this church, I think, initially is the articulation of these principles is so important. So there are a number of elements, and I put them here on the PowerPoint for your convenience. There are a number of aspects of it that are consistent, that kind of tell us about this period and how the Catholic faith was meant to be practiced. As always, we want to start from the outside, the exterior, and kind of move our way in. The first thing that you notice is that the facade is really flat. It's not very sculptural. There are sculptural figures on it, but it's not very dynamic. It's this strong grid. The vertical elements on it are very, very flat. In a very minor way, it kind of, the relief of the facade sort of steps toward the central zone, which corresponds with the nave of the church that allows you to enter into the nave. But it's a fairly modest facade. It also conveys the interior organization. This is a building that has no aisles, okay? And we'll talk about why in a second, but it has no aisles. It only has this one main nave, and these three doorways enter into that nave. So the exterior of the building conveys the logic of the interior. To me, this is a kind of metaphor for the Catholic Church at this time. This idea that they do not want any misunderstanding. They don't want any misunderstanding about the institution of the church. They don't want any misunderstanding about how the rituals should be celebrated, how the gospel should be interpreted, how people should perform their faith. All of these things have to be very directly communicated. And to me, the facade is an extension of that notion. That central entryway conveys this idea of axiality and focus. When you enter into the church, you'll see in a second, I'll show you the plan and also the interior, the idea is always to be focused on the altar. Because who is at the altar? The priest. And the priest is the person who is charged with maintaining the integrity of the dogma of the church. So they don't want anyone to be distracted. They want the nave to focus your attention. They want the axis to focus your attention. No side aisles to distract from what's going on at the altar. Okay? Here's the plan of the church, and I think that in seeing the plan, you can kind of understand this, the way the building corresponds to these new tenants. So the facade, you can see, it's a fairly robust facade. It's a pretty thick facade, but the skin of it is fairly thin. It doesn't have a great deal of relief. There are these three entries that give onto the nave, and the nave is a wide open space that focuses on the altar. It should accommodate a large number of people. And it creates this kind of axis directly to the altar. In these churches, it was very important that people get the right message, that they hear it and they hear it clearly. So acoustics were very important in these buildings. As a consequence, these Counter-Reformation churches tended to have barrel vaults, which at the time were understood to have superior acoustical properties. Often the barrel vaults were coffered, and these two would kind of magnify the sound, again, focusing on the correct message from the church. The last thing that I want to say, two other points. I want you to notice that while there are not aisles in the proper sense, there are these side chapels. And one of the reasons there are these side chapels is that in Counter-Reformation churches that are built after the Council of Trent, the church decided that it was going to respond to a very key criticism on the part of Martin Luther. And that had to do with the way the Catholic Church engaged with saints. So we've talked about saints already this semester. Remember that saints are significant for the act of pilgrimage. And people would visit relics of saints as a kind of act of devotion. Catholics would pay homage to saints because of their extremely pious lives, their sacrifices that they made for their faith. And they would sometimes pray to the saints, asking for them to intercede on their behalf. Martin Luther really criticized this. He said, no one should come between a person and God. You should be able to speak directly to God. You don't need a saint. You don't need a priest. You should have this direct line of communication. No intervention. No mediation. Okay? The Catholic Church reflected on this criticism, and they said, no, sorry. We're going to recommit ourselves to what is known as the cult of the saints. In other words, the saints play an important role in our practice. We're not worshiping the saints. They help deepen our spiritual devotion. We're going to continue to celebrate the saints. And not only are we going to celebrate them, but we are going to emphasize them. And the way we're going to emphasize them is in our church plans, we're going to multiply the number of altars that we have. These altars are going to be dedicated to different saints. And they might have relics of different saints, or they might have altarpieces that represent the lives of the saints. And so you'll often see in churches that come after the Council of Trent, you'll see the proliferation of side chapels. So it's interesting here, the way they work this plan. It's not distracting in the way early Christian churches were, with the side aisles where activity could happen and distract from the focus on the altar. And yet, they still make a space for these side chapels. So that's one interior kind of spatial, an aspect of spatial composition that is consistent with this Counter-Reformation period. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that these Counter-Reformation churches tend to have major domes. They mark themselves in the urban fabric as a monument of the church. And this verticality of the dome also allows a lot of light to come into the church over the crossing. And again, that lighting of that space draws your attention toward the altar. So I think it's very important to look at these Counter-Reformation church plans, the execution of these spatial compositions, as a kind of technology, really, an architectural technology that is consistent with the decrees of the Council of Trent. Here's an interior view giving you a sense of how that lighting effect worked in these churches. The light would come through the drum of the dome and light the crossing of the church, kind of pulling your attention toward the main altar. This is an engraving, which I think is kind of interesting, showing, it's fictive, obviously, but it's a representation that suggests the kind of spatial organization of the interior of the church. The facade is peeled off the front, and that's why you see that there are horses and carriages and so on, people being brought up to the front of the building. And you can see how this wide nave allows this congregation of a mass of people, a huge crowd of people. And of course, the church did want to attract a huge crowd of people. That was kind of consistent with their mission. I want to go back. I didn't put a slide in today, but I just want to call your attention to the fact that this plan, if you look at this plan, you should compare it with a building that we looked at last Thursday, the Church of Sant'Andrea in Mantua, which was modeled on the early Christian basilica. So this is a kind of lineage of that typology where the basilica plan with the nave and the secondary spaces off of the nave is continually adapted and adopted by architects and their patrons throughout history. All of this comes into play at St. Peter's. Remember that I was telling you that in the 15th century, Nicholas V moved the papacy to St. Peter's, and over the course of time, St. Peter's continued to be this important focus of papal patronage. It wasn't really until the early 16th century when Pope Julius II made an important decision related to the building of St. Peter's. The building was a disaster, it was a ruin, it was an embarrassment, and Julius II was faced with the same issues or problems that his predecessors had. Namely, do we keep the building that Constantine founded and restore it? Or do we demolish the whole thing, which would be very controversial because of the age and the history of the building? Do we destroy it and start over again? Julius II made the decision to flatten the whole thing, to destroy the whole thing and start over. So he begins by hiring Donato Bramante in the early 16th century, and the plan that you're seeing here is the plan devised by Bramante. It's symmetrical, it's a Greek cross plan, it's got a very strong geometrical spatial configuration. Unfortunately, I mean, when you look at the plan here, it's a little bit deceiving. It looks like a very light, open, it is a very open plan, but it looks like the building fabric is very light. It's actually massive. The building fabric is actually massive, but it's wide open and emphasizes this geometry of the square, circumscribing the Greek cross, this kind of equilibrium of the different arms of the church, focused on the central point where the altar was going to be located. Remember that this is a completely different plan prospect from what we saw from Constantine's basilica, which was a Latin cross plan. So this building, which is basically a ruin at this point, is completely destroyed. And instead, Bramante executes his plan, which looks something like this. Again, this kind of allows you to see the openness of the building, and you can imagine liturgically, in terms of the ritual, that this would be highly complicated. The aisles are not clearly legible here. It's focusing on this central point of the altar. Bramante, his scheme is accepted, and they begin construction on this plan. But Bramante dies midway through. At the time that Bramante dies, the east part of the building is completed, and these two crossing piers are completed. Okay? Once he dies, Michelangelo takes his place. Okay? Michelangelo comes in, and he revises the plan. This is Michelangelo's plan. See how much clearer the kind of spatial organization of it is? It becomes this very clear spatial figure. The poche of the walls reads much more vividly, and you can see that the crossing piers become much more robust. Okay? So he builds onto the crossing piers that Bramante had begun, and completes the church. He kind of extends the church in this direction, making this massive porch on the front of it. Well, if you think about what I just told you with the Counter-Reformation, where all of these churches, new churches are being built after the Council of Trent, and they have to adhere to Carlo Borromeo's instructions and the characteristics that he proposed, how can it be that the main church of Catholicism does not adhere to this plan? So even after Michelangelo completes his construction at St. Peter's, a whole new program of construction and revision has to happen. So the architect Carlo Maderno is called in to once again revise the Church of St. Peter. And basically what he did, you can kind of see here the vestiges of Michelangelo's plan. Very clear spatial figure. Maderno adds on to the front of it, extending it out to the front and making it a longitudinal plan. You can read here how Carlo Maderno makes these spaces for those side chapels that were so important for the cult of the saints. So St. Peter's does reflect the kind of changing character of the institution of the papacy and the church as a whole. Only later is the piazza on the front of the church added. Okay, so Carlo Maderno is responsible for that extension of the church out into what would later become the piazza, helping it to conform with the Counter-Reformation, post-Trent decrees for church architecture. The interior of the church after the Counter-Reformation continued to be a place of exploration for popes. There was this period after the Council of Trent when the church was highly conservative, did not really engage in very large-scale personal projects for the popes. But in the early 17th century, we see the popes, after they get some time distance from the Council of Trent, they start to loosen up again. They're not so focused on Reformation. So in the early part of the 17th century, we see popes begin to use architecture again to represent themselves and to represent their families. And so one key way that this happens at St. Peter's is through the commission of, it's not technically a work of architecture, but it's a massive 12-story structure in the heart of St. Peter's, which is called the Baldacchino, this canopy, this bronze canopy, which was produced by the architect Bernini with help from Borromini, marking the location of the altar. This was commissioned by Pope Urban VIII, and it marks that axis leading from the front door to the main altar. And that altar is located over the crypt, the burial place of St. Peter. So never forget that importance of St. Peter for this building and for the papacy, the legitimacy of the papacy. Around the dome, there is an inscription in Latin recalling this statement that Jesus supposedly made identifying Peter as the rock on which the church would be built. This inscription around the dome recalls that. So there's a kind of rhetoric in this crossing reinforcing the connection to Peter and by extension to the papacy. Here is the baldacchino. The baldacchino takes on this form, these twisted columns, and you can see that it appears to be a kind of canopy at the top. Of course, it's all made out of bronze with some gilding, so it looks like this sort of fabric structure, but it actually is made of bronze. Absolutely monumental. There are some scale figures here to give you a sense of what we're talking about in terms of scale. And I would like to point out that as a kind of reference to the papacy's new kind of expressive, more liberal expression of individual identity, we see the Pope who commissioned this structure putting his family emblem on the canopy. I don't know how well you can make it out, but these little sort of tapestry, it's bronze, but it's made to look like tapestry hanging from the canopy. There are 3 B's here. This is the family emblem of the Pope who commissioned the baldacchino. So remember back when we were looking at the old sacristy and we were talking about the Medici, and I was saying that the Medici were very bold in putting their family emblem in the old sacristy. This is kind of like the logical extension of that idea. But it's the main monument of the Catholic Church. So there's this important symbolic axis that runs from the crypt, the burial place of St. Peter, through the altar, through the baldacchino, through the dome, through the lantern of the dome, up to heaven. There's this kind of like cosmic symbolic axis. And in the heart of it, forever, is the family emblem of the Pope. And so I think I'm using this as a way to kind of suggest to you that we're pivoting to a time of centralized power, more emphatic individual expression, moving away not just from the institution, but focusing on the person. Okay? And that's going to be a factor that really characterizes a lot of the major architectural commissions that we see in the 17th century. The form of this canopy is noteworthy, by the way, because it could have taken any form. They could have chosen any form for this building, or this structure. But they mimicked, in this form, they mimicked the kind of canopy that the Pope used for his procession through the city of Rome. So again, even this structure is intended to recall for people this visual rhetoric of power, of individual power, that the Pope held or wielded over the city of Rome. I'm actually going to skip these. I wanted to share one additional church structure to indicate the ways in which this new dynamic spatial exploration was kind of informed 17th century architecture. This is the church of San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane, which is a mouthful. It's Italian. You can just call it San Carlo. But literally the name means St. Charles at the Four Fountains. It was located on an important crossroads in the city of Rome, and you can kind of see this chamfered corner of the site where there were these river fountains located at the crossroads. Tucked into a very, very tiny site is this church dedicated to St. Charles. It was part of a monastery that had predated the church, and they called in the architect Borromini to make a small church for the monks there, and in the end, he produced all of these spaces on the left-hand side of the screen, primarily this courtyard and this church. So indicating this evolution from a kind of static logical architecture of the Renaissance. We see in the 17th century a more dynamic, more energetic, expressive kind of architecture. You can read it really clearly here in the plan. While we have the plan on the screen, I just want to point out that even though the plan is somewhat irregular, it does two things. It's longitudinal in the way a Counter-Reformation church should be. Of course, it's not a Latin cross plan, but you can see that there's a longitudinal axis that runs from the door to the altar, right? But it's also centralizing. You can see that he kind of combines two plan types in one. And he uses, we'll see in a minute, he uses the dome to kind of centralize the space. So I'm going to go kind of quickly through these slides. This is the courtyard, and you can kind of see that rather than having a kind of static rectangular form, he uses architectural elements to give movement to the space. And this is the interior of the building. The building is very, very small. Very, very small. It's it's tiny little space, very tall. And the building is so small that people who have measured confirm that this whole building could fit inside one of the crossing piers of the Church of St. Peter's. So it's a tiny, tiny church, and Guarmini uses the dynamism of the form to kind of add monumentality to it. And there's a kind of verticality to it that he creates with these colossal columns. And up above, he's got this elliptical dome with coffers. You can kind of see the connection to that with these coffers here, adding a kind of one of those Counter-Reformation features to kind of focus your attention on the central part of the space. So in the 17th century, we see a lot more dynamic church plans being developed. There's a kind of monumentality to them, even when the footprint is modest. Okay, so these are kind of design principles or characteristics that we associate with this period, a kind of added dynamism to the plan and to the form. This is expressed even at the piazza in front of St. Peter's. I won't go into great detail on this, but I did want to show a couple of images to suggest what happens there to kind of put the period on the end of that sentence. Bernini is called in to complete the structure and that whole composition. And it's a big challenge because the Church of St. Peter's is monumental. And I think this image shows it really beautifully. The church itself is really monumental. The neighborhood around it is a kind of, it's not as monumental. It's a smaller scale. It's a more residential scale. And so in organizing the piazza, Bernini has to mediate between the neighborhood, which is known as the Borgo, and the scale of the church itself. So he occupies this kind of middle scale, and you're seeing the colonnade that encloses the piazza itself. Here's a view from the roof of St. Peter's, and the reason I'm showing you this after looking at San Carlo is just to emphasize the dynamism of the form. Bernini uses this kind of elliptical form. It's not a circle, it's not a square. He animates the space, and I think the reference to the keyhole is not accidental. Remember that St. Peter was said to hold the keys to the kingdom of heaven. It's a kind of iconographic statement connected to the church itself, which we've been talking about. Using the obelisk to focus attention on the central axis. I want to point out that this part that you see extending beyond, all of that was produced under Mussolini. It's all from the fascist era. So you have to imagine that none of this existed during Bernini's time. So these principles of dynamism, monumentality, are really important to the century, not just for architecture, but also for urban planning. Okay? Any questions on the papacy or Baroque Rome, 16th century, 17th century Rome before I leave it? our attention to France, and where a lot of the same preoccupations were in play. We want to look at late 16th century Paris, where the new king, Henry IV, moves in to the city, and he wants to intervene in the city to make it a safer place. One of the reasons he's interested in safety in the urban realm is that previous kings had been assassinated, actually causing a crisis in the monarchy. Henry IV himself was from a kind of distant branch of the royal family, and so when he came to Paris, he considered himself highly vulnerable. One of the ways that he intervened with the city to kind of systematize it was this kind of same interventions that the popes did. He produced important streets, important boulevards, important squares to open up the city. An important commission that Henry IV did in the city of Paris was the construction of this bridge, the Pont Neuf. The Pont Neuf was the first completely stone bridge in Paris. It was wide and open. If you compare it to these other bridges, you can see that it was the norm to actually have structures on top of bridges. If you maintained those structures on top of bridges, what would happen is that the fabric of the bridge would close in, and it would be harder to protect the king if he was going from one side of the city to the other. So in order for the king to pass through the city, they wanted it to be wide open so that the king could not be ambushed. So that was the major, that was kind of the major motivator for the plan or the kind of space of this bridge. But it was also a place where people could gather to see the king. If this king is going to process through the city, he wants to be seen, okay? So the bridge actually has these sort of outcroppings where people can gather away from the traffic of the circulation, okay? So he makes the bridge an urban place. It's not just a place of traffic to and fro. It's a place where people can stay and watch the city, watch the urban activity. So this was an important, a kind of important gesture on the part of Henry IV. He, like the popes, knew that the city was this tool for communicating with the people. Here's a detail that gives you a little bit of a sense of those outcroppings where people could kind of pull off of the main thoroughfare of the bridge. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out this equestrian statue of Henry IV that kind of made his presence known even when he wasn't there on the bridge. The French kings, over time, even after Henry IV, they continue to centralize their power, centralize their government, focus power on the person of the king. The key person here, I think, that is the great emblem of this centralization of power is King Louis XIV, who this image is from 1701, very late in his reign. He takes on his personal reign as a young man in the 1660s. He reigned for a very long period of time, dying in 1715. And I really think that this painting says it all. Everything that you need to know about this guy. He was extraordinarily vain. He was very arrogant. He was very pompous. He was completely focused on himself as a representation of the state. He famously articulated the phrase "l'état c'est moi," meaning the state is me. I am the state. I am the embodiment of the state of France. And you can really see it in this painting where he is completely enveloped in this cloak that has the kind of emblem of the French monarchy, the fleur-de-lis, all over it. He kind of embodies the state, the kind of monarchy of France. Louis XIV was very intent on enjoying himself, and he kind of left a lot of the governing to others. He was matters of his own everyday life. And so when his finance minister built this complex called Vaux-le-Vicomte, this vast pleasure palace out in the landscape with these vast and really elaborate gardens, Louis XIV became really suspect. He realized that his financial minister was probably embezzling funds from the state, and he fired his financial minister and said to himself, I have to have something like that, but even grander. And this is this kind of jealousy and narcissism influenced him to build the Chateau of Versailles. So the Chateau of Versailles began because Louis XIV's father, Louis XIII, already had a hunting lodge out in the country outside of Paris. Louis XIV was tired and bored of all of the administrative bureaucracy of the government that happened in Paris, and he decided to move his court to that hunting lodge. But of course, as a hunting lodge, it didn't suit him, it wasn't grand enough, and it couldn't accommodate all of the activities that he wanted to surround him at his court. So he expanded this modest hunting lodge. The hunting lodge is this little kernel of a building at the heart of this complex. You can see that Louis builds out these arms, extends them out to the front, and also extends arms of the building out laterally. And not only that, but he intervenes with the forest of the hunting lodge and carves into it this vast garden. So here's a view, representation of the landscaping. Basically, the garden is a series of landscaped rooms, really, where Louis could retire with his court and have entertainments, and they can have music, and they could perform dances and theater pieces. And each of these spaces made a kind of private spectacle zone for Louis XIV. Obviously, in the back, there were forests, and they could still go hunting if they chose to, but a lot of those parterres, those plantings in the zone right here near the chateau were really meant for these leisure activities, not hunting. So this is that kernel of the building, that early part of the building that was sustained or retained after King Louis XIII. You can see that it's made of brick infill with stone detailing. Louis XIV, when he decided to intervene with this building, felt that brick was not dignified enough for him. So he enveloped the rest of the building in stone. They call it the stone envelope because it was a kind of way of him elevating the architectural language of this building. And this is the back of the chateau, and you can kind of see that he uses a classical language. It's a kind of palazzo, but on a grand scale, much grander than what we've seen in earlier Italian structures from the 15th century. Louis was so intent on enjoying the drama of his garden that when he would go away from the chateau and return, he would ask the servants to run the fountains to kind of accompany him on his approach, so that the water of the fountains would be at its highest point as he passed by. And today, the gardens of Versailles, the fountains are usually not running. They run them on Sundays only, and there are also these big sound and light spectacles that they hold in the summer. So you don't often get to see it in action in the way it would have been in the time of Louis XIV, but I like this image because it kind of gives you an idea of this spectacle that he was always at the center of. Everyday court life was a spectacle. His coming and going, his waking up in the morning was a ritual. His going to bed at night was a ritual. Every activity that he did, they made it into a spectacle that kind of marked his centrality to the government. And this is really communicated in a key space of the chateau. The very back of the chateau is this gallery space, this long hallway that connects one arm of the chateau to the other, known as the Hall of Mirrors. This is a really important space because if you look on the left-hand side of the image, you see that there's a lot of mirrored surface. Mirrors were extremely hard to make during this period, and even harder to transport and hang. They were extremely fragile, okay? So it was extravagant to have this wall covered with mirrors. The mirrors are opposite these large floor-to-ceiling arched windows that allow light to come in, obviously allowing the space to glow. A lot of the surfaces in this space are gilded, also to reflect and to shine. And you may know that Louis XIV he referred to himself as the Sun King. He made a connection to the mythological god Apollo, who was also associated with the sun. Obviously, he saw himself as the center of the universe. Everything revolved around him. And the gallery of the Hall of Mirrors created this kind of reflective experience. So imagine this long hallway and the king moving through the palace with all of his court behind him, stretching out the length of this gallery. Then imagine the sun coming in this space at the end of the day, reflecting off of these mirrors and all of these gilded surfaces, and the sun appears in the person of the king. It's a kind of drama, it's a kind of spectacle, focusing and communicating power and identity that is really unrivaled, I would say, in this period. This building, and particularly the space and the gardens, really communicate that centralization of power. Finally, when Louis XIV died in 1750, there was a great relief. There was this period of extreme decadence. Everyone had grown lethargic and tired of this constant focusing on the figure of the king. And this simple image, which was the sign of an art gallery in the city of Paris, I think communicates it really well. It's said that this packaging up of this portrait is actually a portrait of the king. The idea, after the king dies, of putting that away, turning over a new leaf, and developing a kind of new cultural center in Paris after the king dies. The court moves from Versailles to Paris, and court culture lightens up considerably because it's not so focused on the figure of the king. This brings us to the 18th century, which is a period of great enlightenment. We see intellectually an increase in rationality. One of the key, I would say, cultural events of the 18th century is the publication of Diderot's encyclopedia. The encyclopedia, to me, is a kind of emblem of what happens in this post-Louis XIV period. Diderot gets the idea of making this vast, multi-volume publication in which he records all the knowledge that exists at the time about the universe in a secular, scientific, rational way. Everything is systematized. Everything is divided into a classification that is easily understood, that is clearly understood. And this really is symptomatic of the cultural movement that we refer to as the Enlightenment. The idea that we're moving away from reliance on institutions like the church and like the government to tell us how to think and how to organize our lives. Ultimately, at the end of the 18th century in France, we have the French Revolution that completely overthrows both the church and the state. So there's this kind of lineage or this kind of development that happens through the 18th century that leads toward that cultural attitude. Just to close here, I want to show just a couple of projects that are consistent with this change. The first first is this project by Boulez, the French architect Boulez, for a national library. Think about what I just said about the encyclopedia. For Boulez, the National Library building was like a physical architectural encyclopedia. There was no such thing as a national library. There was no such institution. So he had this notion that the job of the state is to develop citizens intellectually, rationally, as contributors and partners of the state. And the library, this monumental structure, which was never built, it was only ever a project, and was absolutely unbuildable technologically at the time. It was a fictive project for him, but an ideological one that was consistent with his period. He understood that architecture ultimately, theoretically, pragmatically, and even in terms of its narrative, was responsible for cultivating rational, independent people. He relied on earlier precedents. I'm showing you here a detail from Michelozzo's friary, library from the Friary San Marco in Florence, several centuries earlier. It's basically a basilica plan. It's a basilica plan. The basilica never seems to go away. And here, for Boulez, is used to organize, and instead of having a basilica as a church, it's sort of like a church of knowledge. It's a wide open space where knowledge is delivered to the people. And this has a key impact, I think, on architecture. This is an important turning point for architectural theory and application. I'm showing you here, and I'll end with this image of the frontispiece from Lauget's treatise on architecture, dating from 1753. Lauget proposed turning his back on the stylistic models of the past. He was not interested in historical languages of architecture. He was interested in rationality, okay? And so what he said was, in order to reach that rationality, in order to understand the kind of fundamental identity of architecture, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, to the first shelter. Obviously, this is conjectural. This is not, we don't have documentation of this anywhere. But he is imagining here the allegorical figure of architecture, pointing to what is known as the primitive hut. It's a structure of trees. What is a building? A building is an enclosure and a shelter. That's all it is. And Lauget urged architects, to think about these fundamental qualities of architecture and strip everything else away. Return to this basic relationship between form and function. So he refers to these natural elements, these trees, which would have been used to make the first structures, and he's calling people to reject the ruins of historicist architecture and return to the clear functionality of our origins. Absolutely consistent with the rationality of the Enlightenment. And that really is the advent. I think the 18th century, many people kind of think that modernism begins in the 20th century, but I would argue that theoretically we really see the development of those ideals even at the end of the 18th century with Lauget. So I'm going to end there, and you guys will have your section meetings on Thursday, reading exercise on Thursday.